So you probably can't tell, but I'm so psyched up right now. Like this is the first time. I've never done this before. Like this is the first time that entire session will be recorded in English.
Ah,
Yeah,
that's exciting.
it is. So I have to apologize in advance to you, of course, and to all the audience that my excitement might cause some stuttering every now and then. I haven't been through a whole day speaking English for a long, long time. It's been 3 years since I left the state. My speaking used to be so good when I lived there, but then when I came back here, my writing and my readings got like so much improved. But then my speaking just went downhill.
It's great.
Thank you. Speaking of like speaking foreign language, like even people that maybe know you don't know that you can speak perfect Thai.
I can't speak perfect Thai.
Well, you Thai is pretty good to me. So, can you tell me a little bit about your process of learning that? It's got to be difficult, right?
I would say I'm still learning. I studied the first time in 1997.
Yeah, I was born in '98.
That makes me feel very old.
You're welcome.
I studied the first time in 97. I was here working as a volunteer with Empower. And I studied Thai in the morning, and then afternoon and evening went and worked with Empower. And then I came back after I graduated from college and studied at the Women's Studies Center at Chiang Mai University for a year. And actually, the best part about being there was that I often would have to go to all-day meetings or workshops in Thai, and I didn't really know what was going on, but it meant that I listened to a lot of Thai, which then really helped when I went back to the US and then I studied formally again in graduate school, and that was very helpful. And then the other thing that was really helpful is while I was in graduate school, Ajahn Kasian at Thammasat very generously let me audit a class he was teaching on leftist cultural politics. And it was a very small class, and we had to read a book each week. And at the time, I couldn't read very quickly, so I would literally spend the entire week trying to read the book. But I did because I was terrified that he would ask me a question. So, which he very generously never did. But it forced me to learn to read quickly.
So, like, was there any specific part that was really difficult to you to enunciate? Like, for me, English, the R and L is so easily confused, like for the beginners.
Oh my gosh, I still have so many problems. I still have huge problems with different tones.
Yeah.
And sometimes I laugh with friends who I'll say something and then a friend will give me a blank look, and I'll know that the reason is because I've just completely said the wrong thing. But then I find once I realize I've said the wrong thing, if I try to then say it correctly, forget it. It's not happening. So then I find another way to explain it.
Yeah, but you kind of got lucky because you've been in the part like the people nice here in Thailand, so they probably don't make fun of you, right? Nobody never make fun of you, right?
Close friends make fun of me all the time.
Yeah, so
but no,
that's
yeah,
not-
no. People. It's true. People are very.
Yeah.
And in fact, I joked with when either my brother or dad came to visit me, and I had just taught them enough to say thank you, and then of course someone praised them for saying thank you, and that's sort of like I think that's people are very random.
Yeah.
People you meet are very generous.
Yeah, so you got off easy. Like my case, like it was lethal to speak something incorrect. Like as people would make fun of me all the time. Sometimes they know that I did it right, but they still make fun of me just because.
Americans are terrible.
I wouldn't say like all Americans are
I'm
terrible.
okay with saying. I feel totally comfortable.
Like, I wouldn't say
saying
all
so.
American. I know a lot of very, very nice American, but the part that I live, the very, very rural border, it wasn't the best. Yeah. So you are obviously an American. So and as an academic, you specialize in Thai politics. Can I say that? Okay.
Sure.
Oh, by the way, I forgot to introduce you. This is Professor. You're Professor now, right? Congratulations. Professors Tyrell Haberkorn from the University of Wiconsin-Madison. You teach in the Southeast Asian Studies, right? For how long now?
3 years.
3 years. And before this?
I was at the Australian National University for 8 years.
Was it different?
Very.
In terms of what?
In terms of the university is very different. I mean, in certain ways, and before I was at ANU, I taught at a small private college in the US. It's very different because the place of education and public life in Australia is different, I think. So students in Australia, undergraduate students, most are working full-time and also, or not full-time, usually 20 hours a week, and also studying. But my sense actually is the big difference is in returning to the US, students in the US, and maybe in certain ways are similar to students in Thailand, are really stressed out about doing really, really well in school. Students in Australia are interested in finishing and getting through, but there's not the same kind of panic around grades. Like in the 8 years that I was in Australia, I never had a student who received an A- write to me and say, why didn't I get an A? Whereas in the US,
that's so normal over here. Like this is so prevalent. I got a friend. She got like 19 out of 20 on an essay. She would cry about it.
Why didn't she get a 20 out of 20?
Yeah, of course, on like 19.5. That 0.5 would destroy her entire life. It's very
same in the US.
It's ridiculous. I mean, and I have that habit too. I don't know why. It's just, I guess the university system over here just kind of indoctrinate that kind of mentalities of you have to compete, not just with yourself, but you know your mates as well. So I have to ask you, not from a perspective of an academic, but just a person who go back and forth between Thailand and the state. Is it any like crucial difference between Thai politics and the politics in the United States that worth maybe mentioning?
I think there are some really key similarities and then some key differences. I think the big similarity, particularly thinking over the last year, is that in both places, I think the intersection of both national level politics, the crisis brought on by COVID-19, sort of its social and economic pieces, and then also state violence have led to very similar kinds of uprisings in both countries.
Right.
I mean, that literally, when I think of Thailand, I think of the latest round of movement starting after the disappearance of Wanchalerm Satsaksit, which was about a week after George Floyd was killed in the US.
Right.
And in both places, what I found super fascinating and actually still can't explain as a human or as an academic is how and why those two events, George Floyd being killed, Wanchalerm being disappeared, prompted a huge uprising, because in both places, politics had been bad for a long time. I mean, the 4 years under Trump, my math is really terrible, the 7 years under NCPO, things were bad for a long time, but they came to an explosion in a sense after those movements. I think maybe a big difference in the US is I think there still remain a few public institutions that citizens can draw on for protection, whereas I think here, and I say a few, and I sort of say it cautiously because there's huge problems with the judiciary in the US, the police, forget talking about the police, but but I think it's possible to rely a tiny little bit more on existing democratic institutions.
I think it's acceptable to say that police brutality in the United States is way worse than Thailand.
Yes. And actually, I just said to someone this past week that if I had to go to prison, I would rather go to prison in Thailand than in the US.
Yeah, I'd rather not at all.
Well, yeah, rather not at all. But then in terms of the kinds of violence from the police or that happen in prisons, the U.S. is one of the worst places in the world.
Yeah, and the racist thing too, right? In Thailand, you don't have that like kind of demarcation between you white or black or et cetera, et cetera.
It's profound.
Right.
And I think one of the most incredible things about the past since May in the United States has been that conversations about race and racism that used to take place only on a very small segment of the left are now very public discussions. And they're even, I find it amazing that Cori Bush, the new representative in Congress, who's an African-American woman from St. Louis, Missouri, that she is in Congress, and since she's been in Congress, she has experienced overt racism and threats from a white congresswoman, and she brought it out into the public, and the Congress is taking action against the representative who said racist things to her. I think for years that would have just been silent, everywhere in the society. And I think now it isn't silent anymore, which is incredible. But yeah, the experience that I have in the US as a white woman is dramatically different than if I was a black woman, or especially if I was a black man. If you look at the disproportionate rates of imprisonment, of police violence, lack of access to education, lack of access to clean air, clean water, it's almost as though there is more than one United States.
You mentioned a little bit about uprising. Have you been to one of the protests recently? Yeah. So, is it different to go to a protest there? I'm not talking about the context of the topic, but it's like how people do protests in the United States.
It is different in certain ways. I would say until recently in Thailand, where there's a much greater presence of riot police at protests in Thailand. But since 9/11 in the US, protesting in the US is a little bit terrifying in terms of you don't know what to expect from the police.
Oh, because this can escalate to a riot real quick, yeah.
Yeah. And the police are, police in the US, part of I think why there's such tremendous police violence is police departments are really well funded and have really serious weapons and materials. I can't remember what the right word is. But so in Madison, I live about 9 blocks from the state capitol, which is where many of the protests were during the Black Lives Matter protests. And not only were the police very heavily armed, but not infrequently, the National Guard was also deployed. So there would be a group of protesters and then many police in riot gear. And then if the National Guard was present, then also people dressed as soldiers in camouflage.
I'm not saying that the many protests in the United States are more violent, but compared to here, like here is very peaceful, right? Like people tend to just sing songs and give long speeches and stuff. I don't get that a lot from United States. Do they do long speeches?
Actually one of the things I thought about a lot is one of the protests I went to in Madison was a combination. It was LGBTQ pride and Black Lives Matter together. And that was actually, I wasn't in Thailand for Mobfest, but it seemed like it was quite similar to Mobfest in that it was long. I left after 6 hours, but it went on for another several hours. And it was speeches, singing, performances, but I would say that was new. When I think of protests that I've gone to since being in high school, so often the police will only give you a certain amount of time to protest before they'll arrest you. So generally, especially I grew up in Washington, D.C., and there especially, there's really strict rules on where, when, and how you can protest. And generally you'd have maybe 30, 45 minutes before the police would say, okay, we're going to encircle you. Anyone who doesn't leave is going to be arrested. Whereas in Thailand, there's the possibility, and has long been the possibility, of having really extended protests, whether it's in front of a ministry or, of course, more recently, on Sanam Luang.
So over here, a lot of activists have been talking about the question of whether or not the general movement should have leaders. Do they have the same kind of discussion over there?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think this actually, since Black Lives Matter first first began 5-6 years ago, that was this big question of the difficulty of that if there are leaders, how to avoid the leaders becoming stars, because that's dangerous for a movement. But if you don't have leaders, how do you keep the organization going?
Right.
And I think especially since the summer, it seems like a lot of the conversations in different localities as well as nationally has again been around this question of leadership, both for the reason of keeping a movement going, and then also concern over tensions between peaceful protesters and those who want to use violence, and people wanting to keep a pretty clear distinction between the two.
So from your observation, like which sides the general environment tend to go for, leaderless or leaders?
I guess I have a question. I'm not sure. I feel like watching the protests in Hong Kong, where there was a resonant kind of question, watching the protests in the US, and then watching the protests here, I feel like it's a question that social movements in different places are trying to grapple with. And actually, I think in all three places, from the perspective of just an outside observer, it's this big question for the future. Is there a way, for example, for a movement to keep going without leaders? Can it keep going, or will it disintegrate? And is there a way for there to be a movement with leaders who don't become stars? Which to me seems ultimately so dangerous.
We'll talk about that a little bit. Like, I'm gonna ask this naively. Like, what's so horrible about leaders becoming stars?
Because I think that in a movement to transform society, people who are participating should ideally have a relatively equal role. And I think that if you have stars, that becomes pretty impossible and becomes challenging. And I also think part of what's powerful about a social movement is people being able to participate in setting the future of their own society and within that, the movement that they're part of to create that society. If you have leaders who are determining what is going to be said and what the agenda is, I think that's risky.
My opinion is that I'm not for movement having leaders, but I'm not for the leaderless thing either. Because, like, just get real here, like, there's no such thing as a leaderless movement, you know. In any specific movement or any particular movement, there have to be those people who actually in command of something at some point in time, right? And even though you feel like you are fully owning this movement, and if you want to give orders, nobody's gonna listen to you if you're not that recognized, accepted person, right? So I'm looking for the opportunities for the movement and the activists to get together and talk about how we should organize. So it's a question more of organization and disciplinary of the movement.
Yeah, and perhaps finding a way to democratize leadership. You know, how do you have a movement with, for example, you know, is one potential solution to have 20 to 30 people who are making decisions together. But it's hard.
Right.
It's hard to figure out how to do that, and even how do you determine the group of people who come together to set an agenda? Are they representatives of groups? Which groups?
Right. And the real situation, they will have like those people who are so charismatic, powerful, influential, and sometimes it's just really difficult to argue against those kinds of people. You know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
Yeah. So I mean, we are getting like philosophical here in terms of like democratize. Like, it's really difficult. It's really difficult. And this is my opinion. I haven't spoken to many people about this yet, but I think it's worth getting out there. Is that we have a certain kind of linguistic barrier in Thailand because in English speaking country, you would just call by names, or you would call anybody by names. But in Thailand, no, like we have certain pronouns for the ordered activists, for the well-regarded, respected. So those are to me real barriers too.
It's an enormous barrier.
Right?
It's because as soon as, for years I've stopped doing it. I think because now I feel like I'm too old. But a couple years after I finished my PhD, before people knew, it was actually much better because nobody called me Ajahn.
Right.
But as soon as people started calling me Ajahn, and especially when I meet when I meet female university students who refer to themselves as Nu.
Right.
And so for a while I would say, oh, no, please don't call me Ajahn, please don't call yourself Nu. But of course, it's not really a solution because then I'm still the Ajahn determining who gets to call themselves what. Right. But also, now there's enough of I'm older than some people's parents. So then what do you do? But I have to say in this way, I think often of reading memoirs of people who were in the Communist Party who talk about once they went to the jungle and then all of a sudden, people who they used to refer to as P, someone they referred to as Sahai. Mm-hmm. And it makes a difference immediately.
Right.
In some ways, I feel like it could be, you could have this revolutionary moment if, you don't have to use the word Sahai, you could, but there's so much fear of communism, people might not be willing to, but what if everybody started calling everybody else P?
Right.
Even if, you weren't age different.
I know, it's not like when you say P or Nu, or it's not like when you say it, you are automatically condescending yourself, or you praising somebody automatically by saying it. But I don't know, the feeling is there. Even and me to you, I tend to call you Ajahn Tyrell. I can't call you Dr. Tyrell or just Tyrell. But it's going against the nature a little bit.
But it changes the conversation immediately.
I know.
It's really, and I would say one of the funniest things I had a very radical Thai language teacher when I was studying, while I was working on my PhD. And so usually actually when you're taught Thai as a non-Thai person, you are usually taught to refer to yourself as Nu, if you're a woman, as Nu or Dichan. And my Thai language professor said, you should always just call yourself by your name. If anybody thinks you're being rude, let them tell you, but don't sort of don't immediately call yourself Nu. And so I didn't use the word for a long time, and now I'm 44, and I have been in contexts where I use it. You meet someone who's 70 or 80, and it seems like the appropriate thing to do, or someone calls me Nu, and I use it, and it changes the conversation.
Right. So the question becomes what kind of alternatives are we gonna do? We kind of running out of words here. We can't just call everybody comrades, because the comrade translation in Thailand is so historically deep with the party itself, and we just I want to practice it so bad. I would let's be authentic about our ideology for a second. I can't even do that with the guy you just talked to without referring him as P. And with the words P, there's come all the influence and powerful. Just he was born before me. That's it. It's total nonsense. But we can't just get behind that easily.
It's really hard.
Right. So let's talk about the recent development, political development in Thailand here. So for those of you who don't know, the past year have been very, very radical in terms of the escalation from the people's side, in terms of calling out what they perceive as enemy, the enemy that for a long time had not been called out directly. So last year there was a direct call for the reformation of the monarchy and this sort of stuff. I'm pretty sure you are familiar with all the story, maybe more than I do. I want to know which particular event or like which aspect of the development really escaped your prediction of like totally caught you off guard?
The declaration of the United Front of Thammasat and declaration on the 10th of August.
Right. Were you watching live?
I was
that night?
watching live. So
Yeah.
Madison is at that time was 12 hours different than Thailand, and it was the school wasn't in session, so I woke up every morning, and I was at home because of COVID. So I woke up every morning, and that was a period where there was a lot of protests. And I feel like it's really important to thank all of the reporters who were doing live. So, thanking Bachatai and the reporters for live streaming all of these protests. And I had woken up a bit late, so I was still drinking coffee, and I was sitting drinking coffee, and when I heard Rung read the statement, I immediately called a friend who was in Thailand and who was also, she wasn't at the protest, she was watching live also. And I said, at first I thought maybe I wasn't hearing it correctly. I thought maybe I'm mishearing, and then realized what was happening and found it to be remarkable.
All right. So you actually didn't know, right? I know you have like your inner circle, but you didn't know?
No.
You didn't know what's coming?
No.
I was watching live and I was like, whoa, if people are not down with this, we are all going to jail right now.
Or worse.
Right. I have a friend, he's an activist, but at that night he was doing the school camp, the voluntary camp that you have to go up the mountain and your phone won't work. I tried to call him like, dude, when you come back, this is France. Like, this is no more. Like, this is it. Like something gonna happen to Rung or Penguin, like, for real. I totally lost it. I couldn't grasp, I couldn't apprehend what happened. But then, yeah, the ceiling that we have for a long time, just proof it's not there anymore. So the question now become, what's next? What's next? Because I'm not one of those people that believe that once people know the truth and things gonna change, nothing gonna remain the same. I mean, to me, it's the same with capitalism. So like, we know capitalism doesn't work for a long time, and it still function today, even better, right? So maybe the knowledge is not the playing key role here, but yeah, what's your opinion on that? Like, what's your prediction of the next step?
I wish I had a prediction. I don't know what the next step is. I think you're right that it isn't simply knowledge isn't enough, because if it was, the open discussions about I would say open and detailed discussions about the monarchy, and in particular the significance of the transfer of all of the assets, that some of which had been public, to be under the control of the king. If it was just knowledge, if that was enough to lead to immediate transformation, I suspect it would have already happened.
Right.
I feel like that at this moment, it's almost as though we're in this strange in-between space where both sides are trying to figure out what next. I mean, I think of the student activist who went to Icon Siam and held up the sign about the vaccine, or Thanathorn and his short seminar on the AstraZeneca vaccine, and how significant it is in terms of the Crown's interest in that process. At the same time, it's very hard to understand what's going on with Article 112. Because if you think of just the past couple weeks, the 43.5-year sentence that Anchan received is almost impossible to imagine. And yet at the same time, the week after, the cases against Wan and Lung Bandit were both dismissed. And then, now there's over 50, I think close to almost 60 new accusations of 112 against various activists, some of whom it seems as though it might be difficult if the prosecutor had to actually make an argument for how what they did violated 112 would be challenging. That hasn't necessarily been an obstacle in the past to the use of Article 112, but also those cases are very odd in that unlike all other 112 cases, there hasn't been a request for remand. So what is going to happen? I think I'm probably like everyone else. What's going to happen next?
Because before all this recent development, like Article 112 are not just gonna be delivered to anybody's house, right?
Right.
You have those like specifics, leaders and prominent activists that we can kind of expect that he's in danger of getting the Article 112. Now they're passing the 112 like hotcakes.
Yes.
Everybody getting it.
Yes.
So I mean, it's going directly the opposite. The opposite direction that we was expecting, like, okay, when the people just discovered that this is okay to publicly discuss, well, the authority is just not playing with this at all. So I usually use this analogy, like, it's not the question that the establishment and its highest institutions is still sacred in the society. It's the opposite. Is that they are not sacred anymore, and people know it. But then, what makes people still afraid of talking about it publicly is that the people don't know that, okay, is the monarchy itself know that is not sacred anymore? Like, we know that they are not sacred or all powerful anymore in terms of, the historical thing. But do they know? So it's very difficult. It's like for atheists, we know that God's dead, but does God himself know that he's dead?
And if God doesn't know,
right? So it's become this ironic situation. Yeah. So you're totally right. Like, we don't know. But as a political scientist, you have to have a way of an approach of trying to grab with this, right? What kind of elementary factor you look at the most? You tend to prioritize when you try to predict a social transformation?
So I tend to pay attention to two things. One is trying to make sense of the origins of the present moment, and then trying to think comparatively. So I've thought a lot in recent weeks and months about two different periods that I've tried to use to try to predict what might happen now. It hasn't been super helpful, but one has been to think about the peace revolt period, and the tremendous heterogeneity of dreams for a different society that then led to the crackdown of the arrest of over 200 people in 1952. Because a piece of me feels like there's similar imaginations of a different society right now. And of those 200 people, about 100 were released really quickly. The other 100 were prosecuted, but then released after 5 years. So I think about that, and I worry about that because 100 people in prison is still a lot of people. Right. And then the other period of time that I think about a lot, and the book I think about a lot, is Prajack Gongirti's book, Let Lao Gan Khleun Wai Ja Prakot, because I feel like and I felt like this in August, that the amazing, in August, September, October, the amazing appearance of people on the streets was the result of pent up dissatisfaction from 2006. And in that sense, it's similar to what Prajack writes about, that when 14 October happens, it doesn't just happen sort of out of nowhere. It happens because ever since Surit came to power, or ever since Surit's coup against himself in 1958, there was a group of people who were always, even though they were small in number, were constantly pushing back against dictatorship. And so a piece of me wonders if that's what this moment is, that if we should think of it as the culmination of 15 years of suppression. All of that said, I am very glad that I don't have to explain how and why the movement emerged at precisely the moment that it did, because I think it's really hard. Like I think you can identify as many factors as you want as to why Van Tillerm's disappearance was sort of the spark that led to people coming out into the streets. But why Van Tillerm and not the 8 people who were the 8 exiles who were disappeared and murdered before him?
Right.
Why at that moment? So I mean, it's in some ways I feel like it's a similar question, and there will doubtlessly be many dissertations written about both Thailand and the United States. Why George Floyd's killing? Mm-hmm. There were many other brutal police killings before that in the U.S. Where there were small protests by a small group of activists, but not an entire an uprising around the country.
So there's really just no explanation for that contingent kind of thing. Like,
I think there's not. I think no matter how hard people try, and I certainly have, I've certainly tried, and I taught about, I teach an introductory class for undergraduates on revolution in Asia, and I taught it this past semester, and I included what was going on in Thailand. And I said to students, I can tell you what happened in the 15 years beforehand, but if you ask me why now, why now, and why not why not in 2017? Why not in, why not immediately after the dissolution of Future Forward? Who knows?
Who knows? Right. There's really no like causal relationship that can apply here.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So, wait a minute. เลยมันตัดยัง เปิดไมค์ยัง Okay, so but still about the violence, and you obviously talk a lot about violence in your books. I have kind of an opinion about it that sometimes the stuff that you don't want to see happen just need to be happened publicly sometime. Like, we can't deny that a lot of teenagers and a lot of people, even the former supporters of the establishment, have turned to the sides of the people due to the incidents of Mr. Van Tillerm, right? So sometimes that types of devastating violence that nobody want to happen, at least from our side, is so crucial for a historical point in time that it need to happen. So I talked about this before in the seminar last week about nonviolent as an art of resistance. So my kind of proposal was that we have to put our creativity toward designing the nonviolent instrument that would reveal the violent nature of the state, because the supporters of the establishment, the supporters of the monarchy, whether it be the conservatives, the liberal, some of the middle classes, they are willing to accept that the state is violence, but they will accept only when those violent actions are done and they see it as reasonable, proportionate. So our mission then become how we going to reveal that the violence is not reasonable, it's totally disproportionate, right? So that was my proposal, and I know that it's a dilemma, right? Because who knows what the consequence will be? Who knows whether it works or not? Like, it's really a gambling here.
Yeah, you can't. It's a huge gamble, because the history of Thai state violence means that
For sure.
that there are potentially grave consequences. But I think you're right in that the struggle is to figure out, the struggle for activists for nonviolent activists is to figure out how to illuminate the violence carried out by the state in a way that moves people to take action.
Yeah, because like, no doubt, like, I think people know that Thai state is, evil in some kind of way, but then it's still, they need to see it consistently, because they are willing to forget. Thai people forget very quickly, right? So in order for the struggle to be actualized, they need to be paint very vividly sometimes. And I know it is quite difficult, and people would argue against my idea that, okay, look at what happened with the red shirt. All the violence done are totally disproportionate. It's not reasonable at all. People die. And then what happened? Nothing changed, right? But then my response was that the movement of the red shirt at that time was very particularistic because there was real polarization between the Thaksin supporters, the Tyrell supporters. Of course, I know that a lot of people in the movement of the red shirt, there are many fractions, right? There's real authentic supporters in there too. But at that time, you cannot deny that the fight was really between two sides. So you have to translate the struggle into a more universal struggle that anybody can identify with. Yeah, red shirt drew a lot of people to identify with it, but then it's also pushed like even a lot more people to not identify with it. So I think this is the question that we have to like work with today, because like today it's really become activists versus the police, right? Yeah. Like many of my friends who've been to the rallies are not that engaged with the political stuff as intense as they used to a year before anymore. So it's really become the struggle of particular groups versus the authority. So I think the question is how we translate to that.
How do you think?
I don't know. I don't know. You have a PhD. You have a PhD on this.
I think it's a question for people in the streets. I think about certain movements over the past, the last half of last year, and I think one of the moments I was most surprised by was that after October 16th, when the water cannon was used against secondary school students and university students near Ratchaprasong, it was very, very striking to me that caused, it was really why the police chose to do that. It didn't really make a whole lot of sense, why they would choose to use such force against nonviolent secondary school and university students. But the outpouring of support for protesters that action caused was remarkable. And a piece of me thinks that some of it is about the historical role of students in Thailand. I think students are a really significant political category here, and I don't know if it's that there's a certain amount of innocence attached to students, and as well as the role of students in politics makes students special. But it definitely does. Whenever I meet university students, I always say, protest a lot while you're a student, because as soon as you graduate and you're working, people will care less. But it was almost as if people saw themselves in the students, they saw the future of the country being suppressed, and so came out to support.
And even from the conservatives part, like the cultural perception of kids here is really play a role, because even conservatives would not directly blame the kids, right? They would try to put somebody behind the kids. It's just beyond their comprehension that kids would actually doing it on their own, right? So, yeah, I get it's two sides of the coin, maybe. Yeah. I want to ask you this: what do you think about diversity in the movement?
What kind of diversity?
You have particular movement in particular identities about different topics.
So, I think again, as an outside observer, it was one of the things I found remarkable about the protests especially throughout the whole second half of last year, that in particular that there were women's groups, LGBTQ groups, and groups from southern Thailand all speaking on the same stage under the theme of democracy. Because for years, I think the leadership of Thai progressive national, quote unquote, national movements were primarily men men from Bangkok. Those were who the leaders were.
Sure.
And if there was going to be, so to see all of those groups together was remarkable. I think the question becomes how to forge, from all those different identities, how to forge a shared movement. And what does it look like? And how to, because to do so requires significant work. Like it means working through different forms of discrimination within the broader progressive movement. So it means dealing with sexism, dealing with homophobia, dealing with Islamophobia, which is a lot. All three of those things are big in Thai society, and the progressive movement is no different. So that said, I found it very exciting.
So you're not just for a little bit think of diversity as an obstruction in any kind of way at all?
No.
Not at all?
No.
You don't think it's make it harder for people to unify?
I think it's harder for people to unify, but I think it's essential. I think even if it's harder, there's no way to push. I guess the way I think about democracy and what it looks like, I think in order to fight against the repressive state, the movement needs to be broad and deep and figure out a way to in a sense build democracy and respect for difference and dignity within it. And I mean, one of the things that I found quite amazing about the protests in the fall is that there was acknowledgement of what is now 17 years of state repression in the South. I mean, it's 2021. Martial law and emergency rule came into force in 2004, and so often discussions of violence in the South are completely, they don't happen within the progressive movement for democracy. It happens among the small group of people, of human rights activists who are concerned with the South. The idea that you could have a national movement without acknowledging the past 17 years, I mean, really actually acknowledging the past 130 years, but I'll stick with the last 17, is impossible, I think. And I think the same is very true of, or not the same, but something resonant is true in thinking about women's rights and LGBTQ rights, that acknowledging the forms of discrimination that happen and the forms of violence that happen is essential. But I think figuring out how to then, like, what does democracy then look like inside a movement? What does it look like in terms of representation among leadership? What does it look like in terms of relations among people in the movement? But no, I think it's crucial.
Right. What were your thoughts about like the attempt to radicalize the situation or the momentum? Like lately, we've been seeing a lot of socialist contents, whether it be from just an really obvious like socialist Marxist content to a more clothed ones. I don't know how to use it. I ran out of word. Like the welfare state movement or something like that. It's not new at all, but then in terms of its being in the mainstream movement out in the street is very different. I think it's really exciting, and I guess I'm sort of happy to come out and say that I definitely, I put myself in the category of someone who leans socialist living in a capitalist society. Right. I think this is this amazing moment globally. Like, I think the conversations happening in Thailand around socialism are resonant with those happening in other places. And the reason I find it so exciting is that I think even for people who are sort of surviving in the capitalist world, and I don't know what percentage of people that is, it should be apparent to everyone that it doesn't work. Right. That lack of access to basic things like healthcare, education, et cetera, is so profound. Right. So it seems to me that's one of the intellectual projects of the movement here and elsewhere, is to think about what
what would it take to build actually existing socialism in this moment? What would it look like? And I think one of the things I found concerning, or not concerning, disappointing, was what I really saw as the knee-jerk reaction to the use of socialist symbolism by Yawachon Blot Ek, and the immediate sort of outcry, instead of people saying, okay, we know capitalism isn't working, how might we reimagine socialism? Just because socialist and communist states failed in some significant ways in past times doesn't mean that there's not a way to reimagine it for the present.
Isn't it funny, to talk about the downsides of capitalism becomes so sensitive about a lot of people? Just to criticize how bad it is, people okay, you're going to be like China government now, or something like that, or they would immediately thought of the Cold War environment, or something like that, without giving the opportunities for those kids to advocate their content at all.
Yeah.
I think this is crucial because I think all of the movement or the particular groups need to incorporate the content about how we want the society to be in terms of not just political, but economics, and how people would live on day-to-day basis. Because it's not like when you get democracies and that thing that come with it will be good too. No, you can't get American democracies and you still pay a lot for everything to cover your life.
Yeah.
Right. This is a myth for a lot of people in Thailand too, that they think that okay, liberal Americans is automatically progressive. No, not at all.
Yeah.
American types of democracies doesn't imply that the people life are good. No, it's not at all. I think this is I don't know what kind of image that people just get stuck with of American being just a little bit more progressive than our politics always.
I find it very strange, and I agree. I think the version of of the U.S. of a democratic government, but sort of ultra-capitalist society and economics is so concerning. And actually, one of the things I really liked about living in Australia is that healthcare and education really are free. And it makes a huge difference to people's lives, because you don't have to, in returning to the US, and I mean, I work for a state university system, I have health insurance, but the things that I have been most stunned by in the US are the cost of accessing healthcare, even with good health insurance. It's incredible. And if you don't have health insurance in the US, it makes everything else so difficult. I mean, especially during COVID times, the stories you read about the bills that people are leaving hospitals with. Right. And so it's true, politically one has a lot of freedom to express one's views, but the fact that one's social and economic life are so constricted is profoundly detrimental.
What is it about welfare in America that is just so sensitive to the authority? I guess they would not allow the picture of the market not being reliable. So every time the state are pressured to provide for something, that means it will jeopardize the image of the market as fully capable of functioning by itself. So I guess that was one of the reasons. But then I bet people kids that my age in the United States do not know how to spell the word welfare. No.
One of the fascinating things, again, post the last half of the year in the US is that there's been a big discussion over the possibility of a universal basic income.
Right.
And of course, the idea that Congress would ever pass it, forget it. It's not going to happen. But the fact that there's been a discussion was so amazing and exciting.
Right.
Because I think it truly was a dirty word for
Right.
people for a long time.
Right.
And I think it's essential. I think I have this discussion with people all the time, actually, in the U.S. Like people, I would say people who you would think would be more, what's the word? More well informed, but people who would say, when I make the comment about that, something I miss about living in Australia was living in a society where healthcare and education were free. I mean, in some ways, it was irrelevant to me. I didn't get sick during the 8 years I was there, and I don't have kids that I need to put through school, so the education wasn't such a big concern. But I said, I just liked living in a society like that. And people would say to me, oh, but didn't you pay so much more in taxes? The reality is no. It wasn't that different. And yet, people would say, well, weren't you angry about paying so many taxes for other people's kids to go to school? Right. And I said, no, I was happy to pay the taxes because we're all better off when everyone has access. I think that idea, I would say my sense about the US, I don't know about Thailand, in the US people are so individualistic that the idea that that I as an individual would be willing to sacrifice for the common good, people can't comprehend. And they don't realize that if everybody's life is better, we're all better off. Like, They don't get that. I think that's it's totally antithetical to Americanness.
Right, because compared to Thailand, we still have the minimum welfare programs, right?
Yeah.
So we are in that aspect way more progressive.
Yeah.
than American, and people don't know about this. When people look at America, they're like, oh, it's the first time I go to the state, this is exactly the attitudes and perception of my parents, right? So they would ask me all the time, oh, people over there, they have to be nice, right? They have to be nice. They have to be thoughtful. They have to be progressive. They have to be, just all of the stuff on the good side. I'm like, no, people are actually pretty rude here. They do whatever the frick they want sometimes, and they don't even care. Yeah, I didn't experience a lot of progressive Americans. Most of them came from the media. It didn't touch that in person. Yeah. I talked to my mom. I call her my mom, my host mom. All right, but I lived with her for so long, so it just became part of each other family, I guess. She was still talking about the issues of American not wearing masks. Why is it even a thing? She asked me, do people in Thailand wear masks? I'm like, why would you ask that? Of course. Why is it a thing?
This is something I really don't understand. I mean, and especially, now I think it's definitely gotten better. But I would tell you that, so I lived in Madison. There was a citywide mask mandate where you had to wear masks if you were inside anywhere, but outside you didn't have to wear. But I lived in a building where, in order to get the mail in the building or to go throw trash away, you had to go into a common area. So, and I wore a mask everywhere because, quite frankly, there was so much virus transmission. I don't want to get sick. I don't want to make anyone else sick. So, and wearing a mask, relatively easy to do. Especially it's cold in Madison. So it's it's like wearing an extra scarf, no big deal. But the people who lived in my building didn't wear masks and actually looked at me strangely, why is this weird woman wearing a mask when she's coming down to get her mail or to throw her trash away? Right. And I truly don't understand. And the news about people in the US who refuse to wear masks and then attack, if they want to go into a store where you have to wear a mask, there have been a number of people who have shot the guards or beaten up the guards telling them to wear masks. What? Yeah.
Right. I try to be reasonable here. I try to actually analyze it. I was maybe the nature of Thai people of not being used to questioning the authority play a little bit here, because when the authorities tell you to do it, you tend to just comply. And then with America, it's quite different. And there's also a saying, I guess, that people in America don't just believe in experts. Why? Like you don't have a medical degree. Why would you think you know more than the doctors?
This is perplexing to me. I don't know. I truly, I mean, and I grew up there, I'm from there, and I don't understand. I don't understand how, I think of Dr. Anthony Fauci, the chief of the National Institutes for Health, who has been, responsible for leadership during epidemics, beginning with the HIV/AIDS crisis, and how and why people wouldn't believe him, I don't understand. Exactly. How could someone who's not a doctor think, oh, I know better than this expert doctor on...
It's the same thing with climate change. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know a lot of people, or I don't know anybody at all here that don't believe that climate change is caused by human. And it's a real thing in America.
Oh, yeah. There's tons of people who really don't believe it's true.
Right.
It's like, it's a sensitive, it's one of those sensitive topics that if you're if you're with people you don't know, and you don't know sort of where they fall on the political, religious, social spectrum, it's one of those topics that's like you're better off just not.
Do you think they're just afraid that if they acknowledge it as real and then, whoa, the end of the world is actually imminent?
I think that's possible.
So they were just in denial?
I think it's possible, but it's so widespread. I mean, I think that's the other thing, is that politics in the US, the right wing, especially since sort of beginning with and since Trump, there's people who are maybe like old style Republicans that are actually probably socially pretty liberal but fiscally conservative. So there's still those people. But then there's this whole other group of far right people who don't believe in climate change, and they don't believe in coronavirus, and how do you not believe when there's evidence all around that these things are happening?
Right. But, well, I guess everything is getting better now, right, with the new president and everything?
Hopefully.
What you think about that? I mean, many leftists would say that Joe Biden is obviously overrated. I mean, he looks so great now because you guys just had Trump, right? Anybody could be better, Follow that. I mean, anybody could follow that.
Yeah, I mean, I would tell you, I voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary.
Ah, great. So wanted to hear that.
I wish Bernie was, and I was I think I was like a lot of people, that I was very angry that it seemed like the Democratic Party did everything they could to make sure, I think they were very worried that Bernie was going to win the nomination. And I think had Bernie won the nomination, I think he would have won the presidency. I think, and maybe even at greater numbers than Biden. All of that said, I was really surprised when it was finally announced that and I was not a fan of Joe Biden at all, just because he's kind of like a typical liberal Democrat. He's not a radical. He's actually pretty conservative in a lot of ways. But I cried when it was formally announced and I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that that brought tears to my eyes. But the Trump years were really bad. Right. And the idea that there might be 4 more years of Trump was inconceivable. I lived outside the US for almost the entire Obama presidency, and I moved back a year into Trump, and it was really bad.
Yeah. So you didn't get to taste like all that good stuff at all. You landed on bad crap.
Yeah.
You expect he to bring about substantial change?
No.
I mean, from the case of the invasion of the Capitol, right? And the Biden response was not anything I expect him to do. That's it. That's all you had to say.
I think it is going. I think the amount of destruction that Trump caused in 4 years is significant, and it will. If Biden and Harris are able to get things somewhat back to sort of, I would say, like back to zero, as opposed to like negative 100.
Right.
That will be a lot of work. Because the effect of Trump in terms of emboldening white supremacists was terrifying. Is terrifying. Is terrifying. And that, I think Trump being president led to significant social transformation that trying to fight against will be hard.
Right. I mean, is Trump presidency and his administration has to be one of the reasons that the conservatives and the right wings are now coming back, promoting that, you can live just as well without having a good democratic government at all. A lot of the high range authority in Thailand are, doing a lot of things similar to the Chinese government. Just fully authoritarian on the politics, but then open market. But then, I guess it really depends on Joe now.
Yeah, I should say, I was and am. I think it is amazing that Kamala Harris is the vice president, and I think it's, even though, again, she wasn't a radical, but the fact that there is now a woman of South Asian and African American descent in the second most powerful position in the country, that sheer fact alone feels like this amazing antidote to the Trump years, and is so significant.
Yeah, we are. Believe it or not, it's over in an hour now. Okay. I have something I want to ask you before you leave, though. Right. Now, I think the movement in Thailand have got their momentum stolen, whether it be from the COVID situation or the other. I don't know if you would agree, but I want to ask you, like, you think we can come back during the COVID, or we just have to wait until this dried out?
That is a really good question.
Like, what should we do?
I think keep going. I mean, I have been fascinated this week by watching the series of events this week and the protests around the coup in Myanmar, and then the mobilization yesterday when people went to report themselves for charges at Klong Luang police station. I think you're right that the momentum has been stolen by COVID. I mean, on a personal note, I will say I came to Thailand end of November, and then was in quarantine until middle of December. And in middle of December, 2 days before I got out of quarantine, the announcement was that the movement was on hold until the end of the year. And I commented to a friend, I mean, a big part of why I came actually was I came to witness the protests that were taking place. And so I thought, okay, no problem, we'll just wait until January. Because I wanted to, I mean, I think I'm probably like a lot of people, I want to witness this amazing uprising that is taking place. And then of course with the outbreak in Samut Sakhon, and then sort of how it spread, then that has led to greater constriction. So I think, but I guess I'm very hopeful that once some of the restrictions COVID-wise are lifted, as well as people's general fear lifts with a reduction in cases, I hope people will go back into the streets. But I think, and as part of what we've talked about, I think the question is, what form does the movement take next? Right. And what, do the demands stay the same? Do they shift? And how does the movement position itself so that it becomes meaningful to a large segment of society? Because what was so powerful, I think, about, again, just as an observer, from what happened in the second half of last year, were that thousands of people went out into the streets. And to get people to take the risk to go out into the streets, but also just to get up from whatever they're doing to go out into the streets, is hard. They have to believe that whatever is going on to the streets is somehow involved in their lives.
Or we will succeed.
Yeah. And so I think that's the challenge for the current movement is to how to get people into the streets. I wish I had an answer. I don't have one.
Yeah, I don't think anybody does.
No.
I don't think anybody does at all. All right, so we're just gonna leave it at that.
Okay.
Maybe until next time we will pick it up.
Thank you so much. The questions were great.